I know many of us consider the mini lathe to be a benchtop tool. If you're like me, I just don't have enough bench space to dedicate any to a mini lathe, let alone this bed extension that I want to put on it. Even if we have enough bench space to use the mini lathe, we still need a place to store it. And this storage plan just isn't going to get it. I need to create a work surface where I can leave my mini lathe with the bed extension on it and maybe get some storage out of the deal too. And this is the basic cabinet that I came up with, and I built it in a panic because I needed a place to put my mini lathe together on so I could do the review of it. We're going to look at building this cabinet and taking it a little farther than you see it right here. I started out making the top. The upper surface is going to be the birch plywood you see here. That's 23/32 inch thick. And I'm going to back that up with a piece of regular plywood that's also 23/32 inch thick. The clamps that I'll be using for this are meant just to keep the boards aligned with each other so I can screw them together and not wind up with them sliding off of one another. I put 2 clamps across either direction with just light pressure, and they keep the boards perfectly aligned while I screw them together. This is one of those veteran woodworker tricks that I learned after I accidentally screwed 2 panels like this together when they're a little crooked. I'm going to hold these panels together with a bunch of 1¼ inch long drywall screws. But this screw is 1 5/8 inch long, and this is where I found out that I needed 1¼ inch screws. I'd like to say that's the only mistake I made in this project, but you'll see later it wasn't. And here I found my 1¼ inch long screws, and actually check one to make sure they won't go through, and now we can start screwing the boards together. I don't have any well-defined pattern figured out for the screws. I just want to keep them away from the edges so I can trim it later. I figured all along that I was going to wind up cutting this panel a little narrower, and then we found out later that I really had to cut it a little narrower. Remember this shot? You can see that the top is narrower and it's 5 inches longer because I finally realized that this lathe is longer than 48 inches long with the bed extension on it. I just assumed that the whole thing would fit on a 48 inch long piece of plywood. It's a mistake number 2. And here I have the 5 inch extension, and I'm drilling a bunch of pocket hole screws in both edges of it. By the way, this and the top are now both 18 3/4 inches wide. Between the glue and this row of pocket screws and another one like it on the other side, this extension is plenty strong. This is another sheet of 48 inch long, 23/32 inch thick birch plywood that I'm cutting down to 18 inches. And remember this cut because we're going to find out later that this should have been about 3/8 of an inch narrower. And while I had the saw set to 18 inches, I cut the end panels, which were 24 inches square, and cut them down to 18 inches wide. We need one for either side. And then I cut up some plywood scrap that I had left over from another job down to 3 inches wide. We're going to use that for some strapping and cross braces later on. This is exactly why I have such a big stack of scrap wood in the corner. Here I'm setting up my stacked dado set to cut a dado the exact width of the piece of plywood that's going to fit into it. This is an easy way of doing that and getting it right the first time. And I always take the time to mark out the dados and where they're to be cut so I don't wind up cutting 2 left-hand sides or 2 right-hand sides. There's nothing fancy about cutting these dados. We just take our time and let the dado blade do the work. If we try and hurry this, we can get that piece of wood to ride up over the dado and the depth will vary along the cut. Here I've got the sides laid out with the bottom dados together. And yes, they're actually rabbets, but now I'm marking out where we're going to make the smaller rabbet along the back edge for the back panel. I've reset the fence to cut a 3/8 inch wide rabbet about 1/4 inch deep. And right here is where I should have realized that my bottom piece was cut to the wrong dimension. And we'll show you that a little bit later. Here I'm screwing the sides to the bottom panel. And you notice I'm using my assembly square and pre-drilling the holes. And then I'm running some 2 1/4 inch long wood screws. Yes, these are real wood screws, not drywall screws. I put a couple of screws in from this side, then flipped it over and used a square again on the other side and put the rest of the screws in from that side. It's worth it to me to take the time to do anything I can to keep this assembly square as I go along. Here I'm cutting up a piece of that scrap that we sliced earlier to make some corner braces. I'm just cutting a 45 on either side, and I'm just eyeballing the length. I always cut as many of these as I can get out of the pieces of scrap that I have, and usually find out later that I'm one short. And using glue and wood screws, I'll install those corner braces in all 4 corners. That 3-inch tall front rail you see there is something I forgot to show me putting in. It's also held in with glue and wood screws. Adding those simple braces in all 4 corners does a lot for keeping a project nice and square while you're assembling it, and makes it more rigid. And you can see that I added a center brace because this project's so long. I didn't actually show me putting the 1/4-inch thick back panel on because there's a lot of bad words said when I found out that I had cut these pieces wrong. The end panels and the bottom are the same width. I should have cut the bottom so it ended where the rabbets for the back panel and the end pieces began. Then I could have run the back panel all the way down and hooked it to the back surface at the bottom. This triangular fillet that I used to fix this is something else I'm going to leave right out in the open so I can see it every time I use this cabinet and remembered where I screwed up. Here I have my cabinet upside down on the top that's upside down on my assembly cart. I'm drilling pilot holes in all of the corner braces, and I'll run a wood screw through each of them to secure the top to the cabinet. When I build a project that needs casters, I always use really good casters. I am all done trying to save a couple of bucks on cheaper casters. All of these casters are full swivel and they all lock. Another thing I've learned over the years is to use good lag screws when I put these casters on. Once I set these casters in place, I'm going to turn this cabinet over and never have to turn it back upside down to get the casters tightened up again. This is a job that should only have to be done once. And now with all the casters in place, I'm going to lower the cabinet and roll it off of the assembly cart. There's just me in the shop, so I really mean roll it off of the cart. If this was some kind of fine oak cabinet, I'd come up with a better way of doing this, but this works just fine. And then we have my cart up on wheels, and I can roll it around and make sure everything works right. And because I use good casters, it does. It always does. Here I'm ripping some 2.5-inch wide poplar down to just over 1/4 of an inch thick. I'm going to use this to wrap the raw edges around the top of our mini lathe cart. After measuring the edges of the top, I cut pieces on my new strips to fit. These strips are really just to dress up the edges a little bit, so I just put some glue on them and then use my air stapler to knock them into place. I know somebody's going to yell at me about using the staples, but this isn't fine furniture. It's a shop piece that's going to get used a whole bunch. Glue alone will hold these strips, but I'm not clamping it up and waiting for that to dry. And then I just continue that same process until we get all the way around the cart. I know this is too many staples, but I know somebody's going to start complaining about them, so I figured I'd put a few more in there just to egg them on a little. After figuring out where I wanted the drawer sliders to go, I cut some sticks to hold them there while I installed them to make sure I got them nice and level and the same height on both sides. I know this is simple and doesn't need a fancy tool, but it works really good. This is a simple box drawer with a groove around the inside to hold the bottom panel. I set my combination square to match the depth of the groove and then marked that on the outside in a few places. Then I can measure between these marks, get an accurate length and width for my bottom panel. Here again, it's really simple, but it really works. A panel like this is too wide to be cut with a miter gauge, but too narrow to be cut using a fence. So a panel cutting sled like this is the only smart way of doing it. And then I can slide the panel into the groove before putting on the last side of the drawer. I'm not going to glue this panel in place, it's just going to float in this groove. All 4 corners of the drawer are held together with glue and a couple of 2-inch long wood screws. Of course, you can use dovetails or whatever kind of joinery you want to practice. And now all I have to do is put the drawer slide pieces on either end of this and we're ready to put it in the cabinet. With a relatively long drawer like this, just getting it started and the drawer slides on either end can be a chore. But I managed to get both ends in without looking too dumb for the camera. Pushing it in the first time is hard because you set both of the slides that way. Now it should go in and out pretty easily. These drawer slides came out of a cabinet I took apart years ago, so they need a shot of oil to get them working more smoothly. And here's my mini lathe cart with the top edge wrapped and the drawer in place. I haven't decided if I'm going to paint this or clear it or whatever. And I think I'm going to leave the bottom open like this because it always gets so full of shavings. I don't want to close it up and have to try and dig all that stuff out. And here's my drawer with a shot of oil so it opens nice and easily. For now, I've got my turning tools in here. We'll see how that goes. I might build a special rack for that later, but for now, they stay nice and clean in the drawer.